This morning, you got dressed. You picked an outfit, you told yourself, your choice. But somewhere between your closet and your front door, something else was making the decision for you. You just didn't notice. That's the uncomfortable part. Most of what feels like free will isn't free at all. It's a costume. And in 1971, in a basement at Stanford University, a group of ordinary college students proved it in 6 days. Here's what happened. Here's why it still explains you. The study was simple on paper. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo recruited 24 young men, all screened for good mental health, none with a criminal record, none showing signs of aggression. He flipped a coin. Half became guards, half became prisoners. He built a mock jail in the basement of the psychology building and told everyone it would run for 2 weeks. It ended after 6 days. Not because it ran out of funding, not because it ran out of interest. It ended because the guards, ordinary students who had been kind and easygoing the week before, started inventing cruelty. They stripped prisoners of their names and gave them numbers. They forced them through humiliating exercises for no reason except that they could. One guard began speaking in a southern accent, adopting a persona he later said felt like someone else entirely. A prisoner had a breakdown so severe that Zimbardo's own girlfriend, a psychologist visiting the study, demanded it be stopped immediately. None of these people were bad. That's the part that should unsettle you. They were you. Given a role, a costume, and permission, they became something else within days. Your brain does this because identity is far more flexible than you want to believe. You think of yourself as a fixed thing, a personality, a set of values you carry from room to room. But psychologists have found again and again that context bends behavior more than character does. Put a good person in a bad situation, and the situation usually wins. This wasn't the only experiment to reveal it. A decade earlier, at Yale, Stanley Milgram ran a study that terrified an entire generation of psychologists. He told participants they were helping test memory and punishment. An authority figure in a lab coat instructed them to deliver electric shocks to another person every time that person got an answer wrong. The shocks weren't real. The other person was an actor. But the participants didn't know that. And when the actor screamed, begged, went silent behind the wall, most participants kept pressing the button anyway. Because a man in a lab coat told them to. 65% of ordinary people delivered what they believed was a lethal shock to another human being. Not because they wanted to hurt anyone, because someone with perceived authority told them it was fine. You want to believe you'd be different. Almost everyone does. That's actually the most predictable part of the whole thing. There's a reason your brain works this way, and it isn't a flaw. It's inherited machinery. For most of human history, survival depended on fitting into a group fast. A hunter-gatherer who challenged the tribe's authority figure risked exile, and exile in the Pleistocene was usually a death sentence. Obedience wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Your ancestors who deferred to leaders, who absorbed the norms of the group within days of joining it, were the ones who lived long enough to have children. You are descended from the compliant ones, not the rebels. So when a psychologist puts you in a costume and calls you a guard, some very old part of your brain doesn't ask whether the role is moral. It asks whether the role keeps you safe inside the group. And it adapts to answer that question, often faster than your conscious mind can catch up. This is where it gets stranger. Your sense of choosing anything at all might be running several steps behind your body. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet wired people up to EEG machines and asked them to flick their wrist whenever they felt like it, while noting the exact moment they became aware of the urge. He found something that still unsettles researchers today. The brain's electrical buildup toward the movement, called the readiness potential, began before participants reported deciding to move. Your body was already in motion. Your conscious mind was writing the caption afterward. Some scientists dispute how far to take this, but the core finding has held up in modified forms for 40 years. Much of what feels like a decision is closer to a narration your brain runs after the fact stitching your actions into a story where you're the author. Which brings you back to that basement at Stanford. The guards weren't lying when they said they chose their behavior. They believed they were making decisions the whole time. So did the participants in Milgram's lab, insisting afterward they had no choice, even as the choice had technically been theirs to make at every single time. The mind builds a narrator that claims credit and shifts blame depending on what keeps the story of you intact. Here's the twist most people miss when they hear about these studies. The point was never that people are evil. The point is that the self is more porous than it feels. Zimbardo later called it the Lucifer effect, the idea that situational forces can push ordinary, decent people toward extraordinary cruelty. Not because their character changed, but because the walls of the self are thinner than anyone wants to admit. You felt a small version of this yourself. Think about who you become at a family gathering, at work, at a party, arguing online. Different tones, different postures, different versions of your own values sliding around depending on the room. That's not you being fake. That's the same mechanism Zimbardo captured in a basement, just running at a much lower voltage in your everyday life. There's a reason this research still gets taught, debated, and occasionally challenged more than 50 years later. It's not comfortable. It suggests that the line between someone who commits harm and someone who simply watches it happen is thinner than a costume, a title, or a uniform. Solomon Asch showed something similar decades earlier with a far gentler experiment, asking people to judge the length of lines in a room full of actors giving wrong answers on purpose. A third of participants abandoned the plain evidence of their own eyes just to match the group. Not because they were foolish, because the group is one of the oldest signals your brain has ever trusted. So what do you do with this? Not despair, awareness. The guards who resisted cruelty in Zimbardo's study, and there were a few, tended to share one trait. They noticed the pull of the role before it fully took hold. They asked themselves who they were choosing to become out loud in the moment instead of afterward. That single act of naming the pressure seemed to loosen its grip. Milgram found something similar. Participants who saw someone else refuse to continue were far more likely to refuse too. The spell breaks the instant someone points at it. You are not a fixed personality moving untouched through the world. You are a story your brain tells about a body that is constantly being shaped by rooms, roles, and other people. That's not a weakness. It's the same trait that let your ancestors survive by bending toward the group instead of breaking against it. But it means the costume you put on today, the role you play at work, the way you go quiet when everyone around you agrees on something you privately doubt, deserves a second look. Not because you're being manipulated, because you're being human in exactly the way 60 years of psychology keeps proving. One basement, one shock generator, one line of actors at a time. This morning, you got dressed. You picked an outfit you told yourself. But the truer story is that some part of you had already decided before the choosing began. And the only real freedom left is deciding, right now, whether you're willing to notice.